goes smooth. If you decide that she can get it rolling through, and I'll still mention it. I'm just, my name's Phil, I kind of introduce myself, I'm concerned about this. Review board.
So I'll keep track.
Appreciate that.
If people want to tell the shop.
But I do hear right too, when you say that, what do you think about it?
How do people know that they're doesn't matter? Only like one or two.
Everything has
So,
a
yeah.
place for the right situation. I think they probably went a little bit overboard.
Very kind.
Yeah. Which one? Oh, yeah.
All right, we'll get started in just about 30 seconds. The last couple of people are coming in basically on time, and then we'll get going, if that's good with everybody. And I can start with some of the early stuff. First of all, welcoming everybody, because this is a really good turnout, and that's great. Hopefully it's worthwhile for everybody. But should be important to everybody, including full-time residents, part-time residents, people who are business owners or landowners, and anybody else with an interest in what's going on in South Hero or from abutting towns or driving through. And the purpose of this is, I'll get to the first slide. I don't know if anybody can see this well enough back there, but the purpose of the meeting is to give all the voters, especially in South Hero, an opportunity to become familiar with two of the ballot items that are on the ballot in March this year. And they were petition-driven ballot items, and we'll probably get into a discussion on whether or not they're binding or not and try and answer those questions or raise more questions. But, the hope is we can read the ballot items, and if anybody has questions on what they mean, what they would do if they went into an effect, and realize that they might just be an advisory thing to help the planning commission know where people's opinions are for how they want to see development roll out. That could be good. My name is Phil Reynolds. I'm just a South Hero resident. I think I've been here since 1986, and I really like the town, and it's great to see so many familiar friends and familiar faces. We do plan to record the meeting if the equipment holds up, and we will provide a copy of the minimal presentation slides and the recording so anybody who wants them. So there's a sign-up sheet going around. Be nice to have your name and address. If you want those things sent to you, whether it's a link or a file, please put your email address in. If you don't have an email address, give us your mailing address and we'll get it to you somehow. So again, my name is Phil Reynolds. I am just a resident. I'm not on the planning commission. I'm not on the select board. I'm not in any formal group like that. And I think we'll get pretty quickly into reading the articles and discussing what they mean. But I think everybody should recognize that obviously zoning regulations involve a lot of parameters, and they have to work together. It's hard to just isolate one and say, oh, that's a good thing or bad thing, and not think how it works when it interacts with other regulations. So we hope everybody understands what the articles are about and can answer all their questions or share their pros and cons about what those two articles would do. And my hope is when people want to speak, I'll try and catch everybody, but it'd be nice to share your name and where you live before you start speaking. And also, if we can keep comments to like 3 or 4 or 5 minutes per person, there should be enough time for most people to speak. There's no time clock here, but maybe try and keep it relatively concise, not my strong point. We want to hear both the pros and cons, so if I hear a bunch of things in favor or against, I may ask if someone has the other side they want to share, borrowing a trick from people I've seen run other meetings and do that really well. And we'll try and use a parking lot to capture any questions that can't be answered. In some cases, I think folks will know the answer and be able to share it, or I can maybe share it. But if we really don't know or there's disagreement, we can follow up on that and get it later. Okay, so juggling things. First of all, can everybody hear me okay, or should I get a mic? Mike, for sure, okay. Where's the mic, Marguerite?
She went back upstairs.
That was quick.
Yeah, she was charging it, I think.
Okay.
But if somebody could go upstairs.
The mic battery was dead, it's getting charged.
We have more seats up here.
There's also plenty of room up front. Do you want me to run up and see how it's going?
Cindy will go, I think. Thanks. My better half, lovely assistant. So before we get into it though, there's one thing that bears recognition and hopefully defuses some angst. A lot of work has gone into getting us to where we are with, you know, the 2021 development regulations, the 2020 development regulations, the 2015 current town plan, the 2015 town plan, 2013 survey that the town put out, a lot of other opportunities that we've had to get information and provide information for creating these documents and for working on the new town plan. And so maybe not everything is something everybody likes or wants, but a lot of work went into it. We should recognize the people who put it in as volunteers, like the planning commission and the select board, and all the people who took those surveys and gave their inputs too. So it's a team effort to get there, and I didn't want to go without saying that. And that's past and present, you know, members of those committees. So, and again, we can share this with everybody afterwards. So, unless there's any objections, I'll read the two articles, and I hope you can hear me till I can get a mic, or feel free to move up. There's a couple chairs closer. So, Article 7 is pursuant to 24 VSA Section 4441, shall the town of South Hero reduce the size of the approximately 354-acre South Hero Village zoning district by changing its boundary and the official zoning map accordingly to match that of the approximately 52-acre officially designated South Hero Village Center, and reverting areas outside the designated village center to the zoning districts of which they were a part prior to the creation of the village zoning districts in 2020. So in 2020, we had, I think, 3 zones, and I'll read the other one, and then we'll cover it for both. Article 8 is basically the same thing, but instead of dealing with the town of South Hero, the South Hero Village zoning district, it deals with the Keeler Bay zoning district, Keeler Bay Village zoning district. And that is pursuant to 24 VSA Section 4441, shall the town of South Hero reduce the size of the approximately 280-acre Keeler Bay Village zoning district by changing its boundary and the official zoning map accordingly to match that of the approximately 14-acre officially designated Keeler Bay Village Center, and reverting areas outside the designated village center to the zoning districts of which they were a part prior to the creation of the village zoning districts in 2020. Okay? Okay. So that's the articles. And we have some maps that I believe are posted on the wall over on the side. And there are maps that show the current zoning town of South Hero map from the 2015 town plan. And that's page 77 of the town plan. And that shows what the areas were before this stuff rolled out in 2020. It shows the original Lakeshore zone, it shows the original rural residential, and it also has like the conservation zone, which isn't in play here at all. And then there's a zoning 2020 map, the official zoning map for the town of South Hero. It's also on the town website. But the next slide I'll show up here shows basically an overview of all of South Hero, and in red you'll see what the village zones are, and I'll point to a smaller silver delineated area that shows what those designated village centers are, and what we would, if this were to take effect, be shrinking it down to. So let me scroll down. Sure, most folks can't see it very well, but this is a map of our town, coming across from the causeway, down through the middle of, where the town office is, running up along the shore, intersecting with 314, heading up to the ferry. All this gray around the perimeter represents the Lakeshore zone. And prior to 2020, it included this section of Lake Shore at the same distance and this section of Lake Shore. But this gives you a feel for what we had before 2020. And the rest of it, or most of the rest of it, this pale yellow, was the rural residential. And it almost doesn't matter what the names are, it's what parameters go with those different zones when it comes to development and use. So we had two major zones, and what was introduced in 2020 was these two, kind of reddish areas that were the village zones. This one was referred to as the Keeler Bay Village Zone, and this is the South Hero Village Zone. And again, maps are posted on the side, or we can look at them afterwards for anybody who's not familiar with them. What we're proposing it be shrunk to is more in line with what a lot of the surveys had back in 2013 and we think 2015 with the town plan. That's to shrink these red areas to fit in this much smaller, but prior to 2020 didn't even exist, zone, and this outlined zone down here, which really aligned with a lot of what the survey said people wanted to see for the next ring of development in South Hero. And so that's really what those two petitions, the petition, two article items were going for. And again, it isn't so much what the name of the thing is, we're still on the lake, even though it's not Lake Shore Zone. We're still in South Hero no matter what the zone is, but there's parameters that change depending on what zone you're in. And here's a select set that are divided up into three columns. What's the parameter? What is it in the village zone, whether it's Keeler Bay or South Hero? What is it in rural residential and what is in shoreland? And they include minimum lot size, of which there is a 0 minimum lot size on paper in the village zone, whereas it's 1 acre in rural residential, and it became 0.75 back in 2020 for Lake Shore. Maximum height of buildings in the village zone is 40 feet. In the other zones, it's 35 feet. The minimum setback for the right-of-ways in the village zone is 10 feet minimum, 40 feet max, and accessory buildings have to be less than or equal to what the primary structure is. Rural residential is 25, and same as shoreland from the right-of-ways, except for private right-of-ways, which are only 15 feet on Lake Shore. Minimum setback from property lines used to be 25 feet for the principal and accessory buildings 15 feet. And what changed in the village zone is it went to the principal structure only had to be 10 feet off the side property line, and accessories could be as close as 5 feet. Minimum green space, there was a 30% requirement for green space, throughout all of the zones prior to 2020. With the village, it went to none. There's no requirement for green space, which would mean not only can you build your building in whatever envelope is permissible, but the rest can be paved. So that's what no green space means. Interestingly enough, accessory dwelling units are permitted in all three zones, which may mitigate some concern about what you can do in the different areas. And I don't know if it's worth going through. If you want, I will, but there's permitted uses and conditional uses and prohibited uses, and the details are here, but the full details are in the development regulations. Do you want me to go through the permitted uses or touch on them lately, or?
Can you just define accessory dwelling unit, please?
I'm probably not the right person, but I'll try, and then I can be corrected by several people who are here. The question is, what is an accessory dwelling unit? Okay, my understanding is accessory dwelling unit is you can have a primary dwelling unit on, quite frankly, any of these zones. And if you wanted, you're also allowed to build like a secondary dwelling unit, an accessory dwelling unit. The lot doesn't get subdivided, but it stays the same lot size, but the right to build a single family home gives you also the right to build a mother-in-law home or a child home, somewhere on the property. Probably still abiding by the setbacks and regs, but it's a way of getting more use out of your land. Is that a fair, or anybody want to add to that? Joe?
It can be detached or an addition,
I believe.
addition to the main house,
Yep, we're getting a thumbs up.
okay?
No contention on that. Okay, is that,
Yeah, I have a follow-up question, but I'll wait to follow up
okay,
later.
fair enough.
else history.
This is what we have today.
What we
This,
have
these
today.
three zones exist right now. This is what the
So
town.
all the rules are the same in the two villages?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, so that's why I just lumped them together in one village.
Right,
If you
okay.
look at the town development regs, they have most of the zones in one table, and then they have another table that has the two village zones, and they have exactly the same parameters all the way down. It would be easier to compare it if they were all in one table, so this is kind of a
Okay.
condensed version on one table. And I didn't put in the the conservation district because that's not even involved in these areas.
I understand.
Again, maybe it'd be good if people just said their name even before a question, just so we get back to you. Okay,
Steve, what's their different lane?
thank you, Steve. And
Great there,
Great.
East Shore Road.
East Shore Road, great. Phil Reynolds, Hill Road. Thank you. Okay.
It's on.
It's on, great. Is that a good volume or
You gotta hold that closer to your mouth.
closer to my mouth? Okay.
Don't swallow down.
Well done.
Can you hear back there?
Okay, pardon me for one moment. Think of some questions.
Hey Phil, Mike Downey, your neighbor.
Yes, Mike, oh,
Just to follow up on this question, this is what we have today, but as of 2020, that's what we had, right? It wasn't what we had prior to 2020.
right. This doesn't go back to what I understand is about the beginning of development regulations, which go back to like 1972 interim and 1978 for the first plans. And there's been multiple iterations, but, sorry, there's been a lot of, wow, that's an interesting Mike. This is what went into effect in 2020. It was slightly revised, but not changing, I don't believe any of this stuff, in 2021. There was a couple inconsistencies that got cleaned up, but more clerical stuff. So this is what's in place now. So it isn't like, if they were to shrink, it isn't like it's setting us back to some world we weren't experienced with. It's maybe a reset to let us consider if we really like some of the features or baggage that goes along with the village zone when it's as big as it is. And we'll get into that in just a moment. Okay, so moving on. I'm done. So here's a few questions, 14 of them that a bunch of neighbors and friends and came up in meetings leading up to this, you know, both at planning commission inputs and people just talking on the street and asking me some questions. In no particular order of importance, and they're probably not of concern to everybody, but I'd like to just go through the 14 points, and this would seed maybe our discussion, but if anybody's got any other concerns, we'll capture them. And if anybody wants to drill down on some of these and talk about it, say what they, pros and cons of what this would do to them, then that's really what comes next, and I'll be done talking. So the first is, the village zone area that was created in 2020 was about 11 times larger than what a lot of people, I'm gonna say the general population, not the people working on it, they explained it well, seem to expect, and quite beyond what the SHEZAC survey that the town did prior to the last town plan supported. If you look back at that survey, it was about 82 or 87% favorable for more development going on in that silver outlined area that we looked at earlier. If it got a little bit bigger, like around the corner more to 314, up to Dave Hobbs's old practice area beyond where Phoenix Wire was, if you just expand a little bit, it was still like 60-40 favorable. But if it got bigger than that, it quickly became negative, and that's all in the survey. The reduced, question?
This is Joan Falco, I live on West Shore Road, and I have the survey taped to the table.
Oh, thank you. So the survey's on the town website underneath the town plan for 2015.
Yeah.
And it's also able to be seen on the table to the side here. Reduce setback limits from property lines in the village zone. That can affect what people expected for sunshine on their land. If their new neighbor can build much closer to the property line, and another will come up that affects that. High traffic on South Street, increasing the traffic on South Street if we open it up to things like commercial, which is all legitimate in the village zone, or is that where we don't necessarily want to have more commercial business? Zero minimum lot size, which can really put pressure on development, and we'll get into the pros and cons. Lack of protection for existing property owners who abided by previous development regs and now face closer, taller, potentially more disruptive development on abutting properties. Yeah. Higher building height, not suitable perhaps for residential areas in the village zone. Property tax implications of denser development, maybe pro or con, or commercial development, and things like affordable housing, which are important. Pressure on school population size if we build a lot quickly. Fire damage risk caused by denser development, collateral damage to structures that are adjoining something that might be on fire. Eliminated the green space requirements for the village zone completely. Pressure on the water supply and wastewater capacity. Projected growth and desired growth, what does South Hero really want per the town plan, and project what's needed for that. And also preserving versus reducing farmland and woodlands. So no particular order of importance, just a catch. But at this point, I think I'd like to open it up for people to ask questions, maybe starting with what they, if there's any remaining questions on what the ballot items are, or start talking about pros and cons and what you like.
Steve, what's the different lane? So the town hasn't made a proposal to change this, is that my understanding?
Actually, the town did not, well, let me try and do it accurately and that can be corrected. The town did not initiate these two ballot items. They were initiated and submitted by petition, which is a legal way to bring forth petition items. I think 143 people signed. I think it was well over the 5%. It wasn't hard. Doesn't mean that all the people who signed were in favor of it, but,
Sure, I understand.
But as such, normally it would go through a process and could have been voted on and could be binding. Some of that process hasn't happened, and so this is one attempt to get information out to people before they vote. There's an opinion that the town got from a town attorney, hired an attorney who said these would be not binding. And there's a letter that's available in the town records, and maybe someone here has it, I don't have it with me. But he cited the case, the steps that are supposed to go through for it to be a binding ballot item, binding article, and they haven't all happened. Now, there's some interesting differences because when it goes to from petition, the planning commission doesn't have the right to change them substantially. They can correct spelling and do certain things, but basically, it's your alternate way to get something in front of the people that isn't thought up by the town committee. And the town, to the planning commission's credit, is working on a new town plan and now starting talks since the petition was delivered, I believe. But a few weeks after, started talking about, well, maybe instead of this big village zone that has 0 minimum lot size and a few other parameters, maybe we should split it into, right now it's proposed as a village core and a village residential, I believe are the two names. Village neighborhood, thank you, yeah, village neighborhood. And the village, and both would start to pick up in the latest discussion a minimum lot size. I believe right now they're centered on 1/4 acre in the village core, which is pretty close to that silver outlined area, and a 1/2 acre in the neighborhood, village neighborhood. So, but that's not a shoo-in. It hasn't been approved or implemented or voted on. And a lot of folks felt that we weren't making much progress in that direction until after finally the petition was submitted. So the lawyer says it's not binding. That's the most accurate statement I can give. But the planning commission has said it will help inform their decisions going forward. So that's not binding either. But if it was to pass, it would be something like a survey from the registered voters
But
saying.
this ballot item doesn't change the lot size requirement or anything like that. The only thing it does is reduce the sizes of those zones. Is that correct?
Correct, that's a really good point. Yeah, the ballot item shrinks the area that gets that zone's details applied to it. And so, if you were in a 0 minimum lot size area, because it's in the village zone right now, if it came out of the shrunk down village zone, if it reverts back to rural residential, it would be 1 acre minimum zoning, which is what it was prior to 2020. If it was Lakeshore, no one's even looking to change that. Lakeshore was also 1 acre prior to 2020.
3/4.
No.
But it went to 3/4
Okay.
in 2020. And folks who were interested in doing this petition didn't want to nitpick every article. So basically said, the first good step is shrink the village back to basically what people expected just before and during COVID with the designated village center being approximately what the village zone would become. And everything else would go back to what it was. And then we can work on, it doesn't take away the good work that's already going on to say, okay, let's make a slightly denser, but maybe not commercial, neighborhood village neighborhood with half acre. That would be a new zone. And for reference, I think Milton has 22 different zones. We got by with 3 for a long time, now we're up to 4, maybe we'll hit 5, you know, but, okay, does that answer that?
Bill, I
Mike?
just wanna tack on to that, because he's thinking exactly the same kind of
Mike
thing.
Dominic,
Yes.
Hill Road.
Do you want me to do that again?
No.
So this is where I start, I'm a new, okay, this is where I start questioning the whole binding versus non-binding thing. If these articles pass, does it actually shrink it, or does it just tell the town we want it shrunk and they take that into consideration?
The second.
Yeah.
Alright, so that's what non-binding is.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Hey, sorry, sorry, Ed had his hand up way before you. Ed Smith, Mike?
Ed Smith,
Ed Smith.
Ed Smith, I've lived in South Hero for 44 years, not many years ago, and I'm confused with this whole thing. I've been here, we had a group of people here a while back called the South Hero Land Trust. They were trying to preserve land for the residents of the community and prevent this development type thing. That's what I think the South Hero Land Trust was all about. Many people joined it, many people contributed money to it. Now we have another group called the Planning Commission who's putting on the table cluster homes for the residents of this house. I said I was confused. I would like to know what the benefits to the town is to have cluster housing.
Okay, I can take a stab at that, and then others can add to it. There are 2 different organizations, first of all. Planning Commission is a town body.
I was on it.
Yeah, okay, so you know well. And the Land Trust is a separate, you know,
I know.
private. And a lot of us contribute to that, and it does preserve land, help keep it farmland, for example, by buying up development rights, but leaving the land in use. What was the second part of it?
Cluster.
Why,
Oh, what's the advantages?
why does the Planning Commission putting up a cluster housing on the table for the voters to, I mean, I don't see the benefits, but
I-
other people may.
I'd like to see if anybody on the Planning Commission wants to take that or follow whatever I might say on that. Sandy, want to do it? I'll give you the mic. Thanks. Sandy Gray, Planning Commission Chair.
Not sure I need a mic. Hi. Why do I feel like I need to burst into song? I'm holding my tongue. Sandy Gregg, Chair of the Planning Commission. I'm not sure what you mean by cluster housing. Are you talking about a planned unit development?
I'm talking about people who might live on Long Island in areas of Orlando, Florida, where your homes are next to each other, you can mow the grass with a pair of scissors. That's what I visualize, the people recommending this in the village. Cluster homes. You can mow the lawn with a pair of scissors down there or a pair of hair clippers.
I think the 0 lot size
Yeah.
plays it.
And the planning commission has recognized that the idea of 0 minimum lot size is frightening. So in, Newtown plan, there will be proposed land uses of the village core and the village neighborhood that will have defined a lot size. But the development regs would come out of approval of the town plan when it's voted on by you all. I'm just gonna pick a date of August 1st, because the current town plan will be out of date as of August 10th. So we have to get the new one voted on. And with your help, it will address all of this. I thought, sir, that you were talking about planned unit development, where say a developer wanted to come to the town. The first place they would go is to Martha Taylor Barney's office and talk with the zoning administrator. And she would say, well, you know, one thing, Mr. Developer,
respond?
Sure.
If I was a developer,
Sorry.
if I were a developer, as you mentioned, and I were able to buy 20 acres of land here, I'd develop the whole damn thing because I'm in it for the profit. Who,
Okay,
he may not even live here.
true. But, yeah, nobody can stop that.
Right. If you let it go through.
They can currently do it right now.
We don't have that kind of land on
I mean, there's, yeah. Rural residential minimum lot size is 1 acre, so.
Okay, so I think though, there's one thing I might wanna add to Ed's question. And Sandy's right, you know, the rural residential zoning has been and is 1 acre. So if you had 100 acres, that would let you, as a baseline, if you could fit in roads, but the
I'm talking
PUD.
the village.
In the
I'm talking
yeah,
the
okay.
village.
Okay, so I'll show some numbers later. I did a little math. I can do it right now, because we're on that topic.
Forget,
Yeah,
I'm talking the village
the village,
part
I
of it.
got you, I'm on the village. In the village with zero, in the village area, no matter what size it is, whether we shrink it and contain it a little more where there's already a lot of development done, or if it's huge, a village acre can support way more than one dwelling unit. And the quick math I went through, and I can share with anybody later, but I'll give you a mind-blowing number. If we took the large village zone that we have right now on the map, and if we built the minimum lot size, like what Ed suggested, the developer wants to just get as many lots in and as many buildings in, you need to have a 50-foot wide road in front of houses on either side of it. You have to have 50 feet of frontage, so you got 50 by 50 for road, and you got two houses that are 50 by, if you went to a 10th acre, not much land, and it turns out, except for a moment, maybe a couple arterial roads that feed this stripe of road with two houses all the way down. I've got a picture I should show everybody so they see what it looks like in Georgia when it's done like this. And with setbacks of 10 feet off the road, which is what the village allows, and with 10 to 40, but 10 being the minimum, your house, your building envelope can be as close as 10 feet to that right of way. It can be as close as 10 feet to any of the three property lines on the other side. And believe it or not, it's like 4,900 homes, single family. I'll get you in a second. That's how many plots of land you could build on, and the houses are not just 1,000 square feet.
Don't explain to me
Okay,
those-
so you already know the answer. Okay, so anyhow, yes, someone say that?
Talk to
Shut
the
down.
bill, not me.
Let me give you the mic, I think. Sorry.
Two things I would say is, one, let's be real, South Hill septic, never. Support the clay soil, there's no air septic. Could support something like you're talking about, so to even suggest that it could happen is, just seems so unrealistic. Secondly, we're also under an assumption that everyone is gonna sell their lot at the same time, so all of that can be developed. You know, one neighbor might sell now, another neighbor in 10 years, that's not gonna happen. Maybe I'm being unrealistic, but I just don't see either of those. We do not have the septic, our place, so it's just can't, we've all been there, we're all on septic, so.
To be clear, I was not saying that's what would happen in the next 5, 10, or 20 years, and there are septic limitations. There's also work going on to do some level of sewer. You'll see other points, there's concerns about septic and water supply, and that doesn't change what the allowable subdivision could be. I'm bracketing it just so people hear the ridiculous number that those amount of acres that, you know, like behind town hall and across the library could yield in terms of buildable lots if they had sewer, if they met the setbacks, if they met, you know, all the constraints. It's quite a bit, you know, and that's where the 10th acre.
It's absurd.
So,
It's Mark Nodd's living in it. It's absurd. I mean, it's ridiculous. 4,900 as a number is complete absurdity. There's just no,
from what the earlier requirements are. And that's accurate.
But it's inaccurate, because you have to have in-ground sewer on that lot. You have to have a
In-ground sewer?
distance to your well that's gonna be on that lot. Did you incorporate those into your amounts?
Talking just the plan area, and if you had,
But again, it's deceiving and irrelevant, because it's not the true amount. Unless somebody's going to live, I think that's gonna muddy it up really good. But if somebody's going to live in a matchbox with their setbacks and no human beings in it, because human beings create wastewater and they need water to drink, and those take space on a lot. So effectively, you can't divide it up into itty bitty little things unless you have town sewer and town water. And those are your mitigating factors. So in areas that they can support higher density, you can do it and keep the other ones open. The worst thing that happened to the state was the 10-acre loophole, where all the farm fields were cut up into 10-acre lots back in the, well, probably from 70s to 90s to 2000s. Waste of land, absolutely waste of land. I sat through a subdivision in South Bureau. I've been on the planning commission since, when was it, Jeff? Late 80s? And zoning administrator, and then I took a break, and then they sucked me back in. But I watched subdivisions on big parcels of farm fields where they divide it right down the whole field and put houses up in one spot. Driveways that are bisecting these big fields. That's what we have to stop. That's what we have to get excited about and say, this is not what we want. We want to maintain the large lots. We also, when I was doing the town plan back in the late 90s, everybody wanted the village. They wanted a walking village that they had restaurants in, that they could walk to, the library. We're getting there. We're getting some of these things. I remember the town when there wasn't a doctor's office. Now there is one in town. Those are huge changes that come about in a village. I'm sorry to Island Racing, but they've taken a lot of heat because it's a warehouse. It was not originally in the village. If you remove some of this village zoning from that size, the areas that are now going to be back to rural residential are now able to be filled with warehouses. Metal boxes, warehouses, with no design review. The current zoning, the way it's sitting up now, there's design review in those village centers. So the warehouses, the boxes can't go in there. There's design review. Outside of the village, no design review. The village that you're proposing is basically just what we have. There's no zoning or no development that's ever gonna happen on it. It's already developed. So when you're doing planning and zoning, it's called planning for a reason. It's planning for the future. It's not right now. It's planning for the future. And if somebody wants to come in with a dollar store, as it was before, if they come into the village, they have to come up to design reviews for South Europe. If they're outside of the village and rural residential, they can build their box. That makes Lavin land over here all outside of the village and warehouse basically approved. I think that needs to be thought about. It's not just about housing density.
You can always move the warehouse. Is this coming through?
Yeah.
You can always change the zoning to say that warehouses are forbidden in more areas. Right now, they're conditional, right?
But there's no design review. That's the part that's important.
Well, we need to
You
change
can't
that
stop.
always to have a design review.
But you
then.
can't stop things from happening. They're going to happen. And most of the time, it's pretty illegal to just say you can't do that. And you can't predict what the future is going to be today by being with a minute list of you're either one of these, one of these, one of these, and if you're one of those, you can't do it. So you have to have some flexibility
in the laws, because you don't know what's coming down. And I sure as heck didn't think I'd have a computer in my pocket. And those things happen. So you have to, and all the planning commission and all of this does is the best they possibly can do in the moment, because they don't know what's coming down the pike either. And I'm not saying that the zoning bylaws are perfect, they're far from perfect, things need to change in them. The process to change the zoning bylaws is now longer and lengthier in this town. That's just a fact from the last proposals that were voted on. They took it back to a townwide vote, it makes the process longer. You can't, because of those, I'm not sure if you can make even corrections that, typos and things that were just put in or missed in one table. There's always, when you do something this big, there's issues that come up that you, let's say, now wait a minute, they can do it on page 10, but page 11 says they can't. Which is it? And you have to bring those together.
We're just have a proposal to change the size of the zone.
Right, but that has implications. That's what I'm saying, it's not that simple. When you change the size of that zone, you are popping the rest back into rural residential, which is basically a free-for-all. The town just gets to say, as long as you don't impact the neighborhood in terms of traffic, noise, I don't know what else the rest of the parameters are, you pretty well can do it.
I actually haven't finished talking yet.
Aren't you 1 acre zoning in residential?
Even beside the amount of the zoning, the amount of the lot, everybody has hung up on this amount of the lot. It's not really the pressing issue. Most of the lots, the existing lots in the village of South Bureau or Keeler Bay are not an acre. They're less than an acre already. Most of the Lakeshore, in my opinion, I would like to see Lakeshore 1 and Lakeshore 2. Lakeshore 1 covers all of those lots that are now half acre, quarter acre. Lakeshore 2 covers all the lots that are on the west side that are many acres. And it's zoning, don't get hung up on no acre zoning. No lot size, no minimum lot size, because there's always a lot size. You've gotta have septic. You've gotta have water. You've gotta have room for your building. You've gotta have room for your driveway. That right there gives you a lot size.
Okay, I think we're starting to repeat the argument a little bit, so I'm gonna ask if we could cap it now for the 3 to 5 minutes and come back later if there's some time at the end. All those points are good. Hey,
My name is Dave Gardner, I live in Keeler Bay. And so I'm under the assumption under this Article 7 that the select board alone was the ones that changed these rules, and that the town didn't have a chance to vote on this, am I wrong?
In 2020.
Yeah.
Right?
So-
Am I right? So the question I have is, how can 4 people make all these changes without having a town vote on this? And I don't think it's fair.
Is
So I'll
it
take a
legal?
stab, I'll take a
Is it
stab at
legal?
defending that, and then Dave or somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. Up until about a year or 2 ago, the select board had the right to either approve it themselves or put it up to the people for vote. And the tradition was, they elected generally to have vote for vote, I think since like 72 or 78. And at 2020, there was some comments, this was a big change in 2020. It might have been a good change, but there was concerns, there was a need to get it done. And it wasn't just 4 people, because they did have the planning commission
Oh, I
working on
understand
it.
that.
Yeah,
I
there was an
understand.
effort, there was a process that got in, and some of that process was informed by surveys and people's inputs, and, maybe people weighed them differently.
But they still had the end decision.
In the end decision, it was the select board approved in 2020, and also approved the relatively minor revisions in 2021. Corrected like what Sherry was talking about, like, said one thing here, said a contradictory thing here, but everybody knew the intent was one of them.
So finally now, Article 7 and 8 finally gives the town a chance to vote on what should have been voted on in the first place.
Well, perhaps, I'd state a little differently. What it does is it sets it back a bit. It doesn't eliminate the village zone and the denser allowances, like 0 minimum lot size there, which, you're not gonna make a 0 postage stamp size lot. It doesn't get rid of the 40-foot height. It doesn't get rid of the reduced setbacks in a very small area.
Right, no, I understand.
And it reverts, as Sherry said, Lakeshore goes back to Lakeshore, and rural residential goes back to rural residential. But it sets the stage for where you then make your next change. Maybe, you know, people come to the meetings and give inputs, maybe they say, let's do a little bit slower or less, you know, instead of going 10 or 11 times what the designated village center was, maybe double what the village zone was. And that's because it's generally, my perception is generally a town feeling that people don't want to have just sprawl over the whole island. And to Sherry's point, we don't want 10-acre lots, which is where things like PUDs can let you at least conserve, if the landowner wanted to, they can build as many units and actually a bonus, more units on less than that whole 100-acre field.
You got one confusing spot here, and that is that there wasn't a village that you're referring to. There was not one in the prior
Let
zoning
me
bylaw.
restate it, maybe I didn't say it correctly.
You're creating a new, different village from the one that is currently in. You're not reverting to an old village.
What we're saying is the size, I may not have spoken correctly. The size of what the village would be if Articles 7 and 8 went into place, into practice, would be approximately, very close to the size of what the, I'm gonna try to get the right term,
But
the
that's from,
designated village center was, which was not a zone. but
it's
that
not
was-
from zoning,
That's right.
it's from something else. Where
It's
did
a-
that come from?
That came from the SHEZAC survey, and it was done to make sure that we could get grants from the state for planning by creating basically that area that was, think of it like an overlay. It's not quite the right term, but think of it as basically along Route 2 and 314. And that's where people said they wanted development, and I think people would be okay with, I think, my opinion doesn't really matter though, growing a little bit wider than that, but it got negative in those surveys if it got much bigger, like all the way down South Street. So I'm not making that up, and that's what led to the concern. Sandy?
Let me just clarify for you, the boundary in the articles is really the boundary of the village center designation, which is a state program that supports the revitalization efforts of small, medium-sized historic centers. I'm reading right off a state description of the program. It is not a zoning district. It was set up as a tax benefit to revitalize historic buildings. And that is why it's so small. In fact, we had originally, when we first applied for village center designation, had the area larger. And then the state people came down, Richard Moray came down and said, no, you can't include all that open land. This is only for the existing historic buildings, which is why it is so small. There's no place left to infill.
Thank you. Want to move on to other points? Joe?
I brought two maps from the current town plan, and they're on the wall there. One reflects the zoning that was present at that time, and the next one shows a proposed land use, and that is very equivalent to what we would have if we rolled back the sizes to the Articles 7 and 8. In other words, those designated village centers are very close in size to what was proposed and supported by our current town plan, which is very small acreage. Look at those maps. It says map 7 reflects the current zoning, which was just, you know, a big island with a fringe of shoreland and then a few conservation areas, wetlands. And it says this is our current town plan, considering the addition of village zoning districts encompassing the South Hero and Keeler Bay village areas. And that on the map are tiny little red dots, if you look at them. And they call that proposed land use. And those are potential zoning districts. So envisioned by our current town plan are these tiny little areas for dense development. I have other things to say, but I won't say them now about water supply and wastewater.
So, sure. Actually, before we start cycling through people, I think I missed you the first time around, so.
I'll put this on the table if anybody wants to read what the current town plan says about those two maps.
Being the oldest guy in the room, I have some liberty, I guess. My name is George Rice. A little bit of history. When I first came to town, moved here from Montpelier, the planning commission in that year spent a lot of time rewriting the regulations. In those days, the regulation had to be approved by the voters, and not by the select board. And this went on for a number of years, and the reason why they did that is because when they did overall zoning regulations, everyone found something they didn't like, so they voted the whole thing down. And I know a couple in this room who have admitted to that. So that's the reason why. I'm not saying it was a good decision or a bad decision, but that's how we got to where we are now. Actually, the gorilla in the room is Act 250. It's a terrible law. As one Burlington judge told me one time, Jonathan Brownell wrote the law in the shower. And then when the law passed, he went to Dartmouth and taught urban planning for the rest of his life. And he was responsible for these cigarette lots that went on forever and were a total waste of resources. And then in that same period of time, the legislature rewrote the entire zoning law, separate chapter. And that's what created the opportunity to have PUDs and other matters to hopefully preserve open land. Now, a PUD, in its simplest terms, is a guy that owns 100 acres and he wants to put up, say, 40 houses. He does those 40 houses on maybe 30 acres, and the rest of it is open land. Common open land. Doesn't belong to any of the people who own the homes. And that's the main reason. And we have not exercised that very much in South Hero. I guess we haven't had any interest in doing it. But it certainly would solve some of the issues we're talking about. The other thing is that I'm not here to advocate one way or the other on these articles. But I just wanted to make sure that we have this talk about creating this new system. But then I talked to Nate Haywood, who had to go 1,000 feet across from his brewery to get wastewater disposal across the road. So I guess we have some problems here with wastewater. And if we do, and if we do pass all of these changes to the zoning regulations, that doesn't mean that they're ever going to work unless we have a sewer disposal problem solved. Does that mean the town is then going to have to pay for a sewage treatment plant? Don't know the answer to that, but if you're going to create a high-density area in a village area, something has to happen. Think about what we might be required to do in the future. As far as now getting into the villages, I'm not an expert, but I have visited several European countries, Italy, France, Germany, Switzerland, and they have a very good concept as to how they treat their municipalities, their communities. If you go to any of these small towns in these countries up in the hills, they have a town square, they have buildings all the way around it, commercial, some of them are apartments. And then everything beyond that is forestry, agriculture, and that's the way they control it. If you want to live in this town, you got to live here, and the rest of it is for the guys who you know, have dairy farms and grow produce. That's the way they do it, and it's been that way for several hundred years. Now, can we do that here? Don't know if we've lost that or not. But the point is that if you're gonna do that, try a small area first, and then expand as you need it if you have to. You know, I don't advocate for or against low-income housing. I don't advocate for, you know, a lot of other things. I remember when I was on the zoning board, though, that a conditional use was allowed anywhere. So if you had a crematorium and you wanted to build on South Street next to Hackett's, Hackett couldn't stop you from building the crematorium. You can only decide what the conditions would be. You know, maybe some cedar trees out or a fence. But conditional uses were everywhere. And the planning commission has saw to it to kind of rein that in. But when we're talking about this issue, let's think about, do we want to have a concentrated area, which is quasi-commercial at this point, and then try to maybe change that in the outlying area. The minimum lot size is somewhat of a red herring because, you know, I could buy 4 minimum lot size properties and make it into a 10-acre property, and that would kind of defeat the idea of having a minimum lot size. But is it a good idea to have people who can't afford to buy a 10-acre lot, don't want to be out far away, they want to be near what is now the two communities within the town, their doctor, the library, fire and rescue, cider, Keela Bay store, and the other one, there's a church nearby on South Street, a church across from Keela Bay. Those are the areas we should be concentrating in, and not creating something which is beyond what would occur in the next 20 years. I think we should do it incrementally. What that should be, I have no idea. I mean, that's up to getting the planning commission to come around and convince them what you think it should be. But having said that, you know, go to the polls, vote the way you want, but think about what you want in the long term. Thanks.
George, Steve?
Steve Robinson, Route 2. Free speeches, whether we vote all yay or we vote all nay, the select board still has to approve. So we either send a message or we don't. But the select board is the one that's gonna have to make the decision like they did before.
That was quick. Is there anybody who hasn't spoken yet who'd like to?
I just wanted to clarify one thing, I don't, it's not a matter of opinion, but the first town plan that put in a village area was the one we did in 95, I think, or 96. That's when it had 2 village districts, one that was centered around 314, and one that was centered around it kind of went from Stevens Farm in a egg up around the center of town with the Hill Road intersection, South Street intersection, and then it went up to the school. So that was in the late 90s or mid 90s that designation was put in the town plan. It was never put in the zoning bylaws, but it was put in the town plan. So that's not something new.
Okay.
change about this area with what you're, what the planners at the board have been looking?
Bill, can you rephrase the question? We can't hear it up here.
So Peg's asking the question about,
This change with what's proposed, being proposed,
in the next town plan, or
Yeah.
in the two articles? So,
what is,
Village center designation will change. That's not a zoning district.
you're gonna answer everything.
Village, you're looking at a South Hero Village Center designation map. That's the state designation, and it's not a zoning map.
What is the village?
And that will
zone?
change.
What is the village zone along to this section of the two?
You have to look at the map that.
So there's two, if I doesn't propose this, maybe we take a 5-minute stretch break. People can look at the maps if they want and just, let their thoughts, think about additional comments you want to have. Over here on the side is maps that show in the red, pinkish, red, the village zones in Keeler Bay and in the South Shore Islands. Two separate land areas that are considered village today. And what the two ballot items say is, shift them down for now, to keep that denser stuff, not changing any of the plans about, to the area that's outlined in black on these maps. And then that might serve as the core to expand and make village neighborhoods beyond it, or go a little bit beyond it. It's the input that we give to the planning. Helps us plan what they want. If it's a lot to grow, I think the state has a requirement to plan for what the expected growth is over the next decade and the decade after. So what George mentioned, it's kind of a minimum 20-year expansion plan. Do you really want to do a 200-year expansion plan now, or cover 2030? That's the thought.
But I think take it a step further.
Or we'll hit the mic.
What she's asking is, according to these articles, it becomes that map, what it is currently is this map. And it's about, if you did both village, South Hero and Keeler Bay, it's about an 89% decrease in land.
It'd be about 89% decrease, just like in 2020 was about the inverse number increase. So it's not sending it back to 50 years ago. It would be a pause.
So South Hero to the school is now village, or South Hero to the school, or South Street is residential neighborhood?
Bill, the map is showing on the screen.
Right now it's village zone. Village zone. And I think another confusion factor is we use the word village in so many contexts that people hear, village, and think they know which one of 3 different villages we're talking about. Designated villages, South Shore Village, we're talking about Keeler Bay. It's not the greatest choice of street names. I propose 5-minute break, just stand up, stretch, take a look at the map, it really helps to know the areas between these ballot items. If that's fair.
Cycle through the maps. Bob, can you cycle through the maps?
Pardon?
Could you just go cycle through the maps?
Somebody should explain that map.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, that everybody's moving around. Well, I can, it's hard to tell. Yeah, so that's. Which is a lot more. I'm sorry.
Real quickly, while we're talking and stretching, can anybody not sign the sheet? You don't have to.
She's just like another mother to them. So it's a huge, otherwise I'd be right back and forth. But still, I want her responsibility.
Yeah.
Yes, I have a fellow, I don't do, I live in area. Fellow that's been doing it for years. At one point, I had my mother sitting there, was my TV, Jim's. I was just, so I just put them into big round bottles, check this out. But I don't have that. But yeah, well, sometimes it's a physical. My other two brothers, I have three. One in Connecticut, very, it's kind of like
Tony Kay.
Hi, Tony. Nice to meet you. And, yes. Where do you live? Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, the winery, yeah. Yeah, I live right across the street from the churchyard.
One of the effective. There's a committee active now exploring that.
For the time being, it's land-based right now, but there's nothing to say they could put on wastewater treatment facility. I mean,
Our soils
and you can get water from the lake, like now by Chicago, it's water. Now they have big lake. I mean, it's not, it's big here.
So even after the committee finished evaluation, like the town wants to that's what we
Sit down, sit down. Yep. Okay.
Now I gotta wait for the first Saturday in May.
Just one, two. Okay, the first thing I want to do is, there were 4 things that were shared with me during that little break, and I'm going to do my best to articulate them and share them with everybody.
I know Phil well. Is he just from my region?
The first thing is, David Carter asked me to adjust or correct a little bit what Steve Robinson said. I think Steve may have had notes.
He left.
Okay. Well,
He said his piece.
I'll try. He said his piece. The way it works now is when a change comes up for the town plan or the development regs, it's not the select board that approves it. It's up to people's votes. So I think Steve was looking at some of the past practices where there was the option, could have gone either way. And so I think there's no argument here, doesn't need any follow-up. You know, now we vote. So there's a process that gets them there, the planning commission works on it, they get hearings. Then they take it to the select board and get some feedback, and they often have a hearing, they might kick it back, it might loop a couple times. But in the end now, it wouldn't be, the select board has to make the decision, it's up to the people. So it's good to be informed, and there's a tough language, you gotta know the difference between zones and overlays, and, there's a lot to it. None of us have the time to do this full-time job, so again, my hat is truly off to the folks who work the planning commission and try and distill it to something that we basically want. And George had a good comment too. If there's one thing that really bugs you, and there you are, George, you moved. And it really bugs you, and everybody votes no for their one thing, you can have a 97% great document, and it'll fail because a lot of people don't like 1 or 2 or 3%. So it's a tough thing. And maybe that means even on plans, we do a smaller incremental change. So just say, hey, if I cut my side setbacks down from 25 to 10, do we like it or not? And you might like it until they can build 40 feet tall. It's tough to make it work. So that's enough on that. Second person was Mike had a comment wanted to share, and that was about, or you want me to share?
No, either way, it was just, what I didn't realize when I came here was the fact that the articles themselves are somewhat disconnected from the planning documents that we've been all looking online, the proposed land.
Okay, yes.
The proposed lines, I'm gonna call them, because I don't wanna use the word zones because I'm afraid.
Right.
But
You say it's
the
related
idea
here.
was, I did not realize that was not really related to these, voting on these articles. These articles only shrinks the area
These articles shrink the area
That's
to
the next
about
step.
10% or 9% of what was created in 2020, and maybe sets the stage so that the work that's going on right now with the planning commission to, maybe expand a little bit what we think was a village zone, and they're calling it the core, but it's not up for vote yet, this doesn't affect that, and maybe introduce a new area, basically within what this 2020 village zone is, that might be the village neighborhood. And again, the numbers that are being floated on this future thing, and I think they can still adjust it if people want to give input, but I think it's pretty good, quite frankly. The half-acre lot in the village neighborhood, which would be like 90% of this village zone, perhaps, or maybe along the existing roads, I don't know. And more like, it's still not changing the zero minimum lot size that I saw in the village core, which would be what this would more likely become.
Oh, it did, but okay.
You gotta go to those meetings and see. They're really not what this is about.
Yeah.
If that happens or not, this, if it were to happen, would shrink it to the pictures. So the third thing I want to make, I think Michelle asked, was folks should realize that what these two articles are trying to describe, correctly stated earlier by several folks, we're pointing to a map that was based on the designated village center. And that wasn't a zoning document, but it was a map that showed an outline of a certain amount of area. And that was a certain amount of area that everybody was pretty, 82 or 87% compatible with for denser development, even though it's a lot built out. Quite frankly, some of the things in there are also ready to maybe be recycled. It's not, bottom line is, this would use that older map of the designated village center and say, this is what your village would become if it were implemented. And it's actually a little bit bigger designated village center than what we were originally talking about back in, I'm gonna get the year wrong, certainly before 2020. It got made a little bit bigger and picked up some of this land that's down around here and goes beyond where the library and buildings are. So I hope that's clear. Things that are future town plan things, maybe in August this year, and need to be resolved, and things that are future development regs in terms of what's allowed in a zone are not on the table here. This is purely shrinking an area. I call it a reset, a pullback to something not as big as it is now, and not where it didn't exist 3 years ago, or actually about 2 years ago now, because it was in 2021 they got put in place. Okay, early. And then there was a fourth thing, and I'm forgetting what it was. Sandy's got some paperwork that another group put together that she'd like to hand out, and
Not my document.
not her document, but she's the.
Don't kill the messenger.
But it's a perspective, and it's worth reading and making sure people make an informed decision.
Who created this document? Who's
Prepared by a group of concerned South Bureau residents who are in Atlanta because their plane couldn't make it from California to Burlington. And somewhere else on vacation.
And these are the authors of the articles?
No.
No,
The authors in the article are another,
Group.
different group. Okay, thank you.
So.
you might think of it as the opposition group.
I didn't
Another
wanna say
perspective.
that. I didn't wanna say
Yeah, but it's
that.
not opposition in any nasty way.
Anybody interested?
The group that put the articles together was a loose
You
group
got
of
it.
people.
Okay.
There's no dues, there's no membership. It's the folks who have the SouthHeroVoters.org website, and it's a bunch of folks, and
Are you,
I don't remember, I'm
are
sure.
you representative of that?
I was asked to do I would say I'm aligned with it pretty closely.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fair.
Maybe repeat
It
again.
doesn't mean everybody agrees on everything for all topics, but it's, on this thing, I think that's fair.
Okay, Phil?
Yes, okay. Was that a hand, Marcy? Oh, I'm sorry, okay. Oh, you did copy, yeah. Sure.
Just really repeat one more time, very clearly that was now is not a
Okay. I hope there's enough copies, but Sandy Gregg is handing out copies from another group that couldn't make it here tonight. Wasn't part of this presentation, but it's a good information share, right?
I already have a question.
Okay.
Because this document is saying
Here,
that,
it's unfortunate,
so,
I don't know who's here who can speak to
so
that.
articles, it's saying Article 7 and 8, if approved, but again, this isn't about getting these approved, correct?
I don't know what this is about, I haven't read that. But they wanna shrink the village zone.
I understand that, but they are not up for being approved or not.
Well, you're gonna vote yes or no or can't pass on that. And the understanding is,
They're not being approved, they're just going to go, they're gonna be input into the plan.
when they were submitted, they were expected to go into place. And, is it worth giving a quick procedure on that? One of the things I didn't want to do, or be one. If there's more yeses than nos, they're approved. The question is whether they're implemented. And if they're advisory only, then that doesn't guarantee any of our adoption. If they weren't advisory, they would have been on. And there's a whole process to get through there. Those kinds of petition driven, things. The process is supposed to be followed, is warning readings of letters, and inviting, we invited all the folks that have normally been invited. We invited the adjoining planning commission, the Northwest Regional Planning Commission, the state housing and
I believe
development.
it is concerned, I mean, everything is concerned.
And,
All Hackett's is concerned.
Well, not everyone.
Allen's is concerned. What?
The language I heard earlier
Is
said
Goulet
that they
Is he concerned?
I don't know, I don't think so, I don't think so.
Look to the planning.
we would not be able to.
They would not be approved and implemented, they would be advisory only.
That was my understanding.
Oh, but is that opinion, are we going with that opinion, or is that?
I need you to judge that for yourself. I mean, until it goes to a court, nothing's settled, right? And even then there's appeals. Sorry.
Tim Maxim, I've been involved in this process and watched it over the years, and my opinion, from what I know about laws and statutes and everything else, is that the advice that the select board got from their town attorney is right on. A vote of yes on these two articles is only advisory. It does not change anything. State statute and bylaws, zoning bylaws and so forth, has requirements in there where any changes have to go through a process, two-step process. It's been mentioned here a couple times tonight. The planning commission has to make those recommendations. They have to draft, it's fairly simple probably, but they have to draft and make changes to the regulations to do what you're asking them here to do. They do have to have a public hearing warned 15 days in advance where you would come and take a look at what they're proposing. You'd have comments and questions and so forth. Once that public hearing is held, then that same process has to be done by the select board. They have to warn a public hearing 15 days in advance and have a hearing where people can come, ask questions, make comments. In that process, they can also, the planning commission could make some minor changes, and if they aren't major, they might change it a little bit. But it's a two-step process, public hearings, planning commission, and the select board. And then that draft, paper draft and so forth would have to be presented, given out to the body, townspeople. And then the way you've got things set up here, you would come back to another town meeting vote to adopt those changes. So what you're doing here tonight, you're gonna be doing again if you vote yes on those.